Untrammeled Approaches by Jacques Maritain. Chapter 14. For an Existential Epistemology. No knowledge without intuitivity. Reason and thinking.
Reason, said Heidegger, is the most implacable enemy of thought. This is a kind of blasphemy against human intelligence. Human intelligence, bound as it is to the body and senses, is at the lowest rung on the ladder of spirits. However, it is still spirit and certainly has to reason. But it is an intellect which reasons. As an intellect, it is capable of grasping intuitively. By becoming something intentionally, it sees that thing or reads in it. As reason, it advances by means of a discourse which gathers concepts together to have the evidence of the first principles pass through them. Wiser than Heidegger, the ancients distinguished between discursive reason and intuitive reason. Rational discourse is a chain or tissue of conceptual statements strung together by logical connections leading to necessary conclusions. In contrast, the intuitive functioning of the intellect is characterized by a certain immediacy. To make my vocabulary precise, I shall reserve the word intuition for the intuition of the external sense, for the creative intuition proper to the poet, or for purely intellectual and cognitive intuition. Here, I am thinking of those intuitive judgments which govern all logical connections and which, joining together immediately, a subject concept and an object concept, still fall under the jurisdiction of the notional order, like the principle of identity and other primary assertions. I am also thinking especially of the metaphysical intuition par excellence, the intuition of being, that privileged judicative act by which, seeing without putting together concepts, the intellect seizes directly upon the real.
Abstractive operation and intuitivity. Let us look at the first operation of the mind, in which the agent or illuminating intellect draws from the sensible real, which has been grasped by the perception of the external sense and then interiorized by the imagination. The determination of the intellectual faculty, which enables this faculty to know, to utter within itself, always under the action of the illuminating intellect. An idea, a concept or mental word, by means of which it perceives the intelligible, then seizes it, in exercised act. This process is an abstractive process, but one which envelops an intuitivity. For the concept or mental word is not the object known by our intelligence in the first operation of the mind. It is the intentio intellecta, which makes it possible to become the other immaterially. It is the bearer of the thing to be seen, thanks to which the identification with that thing takes place in the mind, and by means of which the object is known. In its relation to the intelligible object drawn by abstraction from the sensible real, the concept, because it makes us perceive or reveals this intelligible to us, entails, however abstract it may be, a certain element of intuitivity. Once it is stored in the mind, it will always keep this kind of intuitivity which is proper to it. When we handle our concepts like signs to be organized and put together, they continue to bear the signified within them. That is, the intelligible object we have attained thanks to them, and which they show us directly or, if it is of the metaphysical order, which they present to us analogically, as if in a reflection. It is only through the reflection proper to logic that the concept is known as such, and itself becomes an object of thought.
The verbum mentis I just spoke of is the concept spontaneously and naturally formed by the intelligence. There are also artificially formed concepts, as seen in the conceptual vocabulary of the sciences or philosophy. These always presuppose natural concepts with their element of intuitivity and refer to them in a more or less distant manner. But it can happen that they are wrongly formed when the object they present to the mind has itself been formed by the mind according to a system of ideas that is not founded in truth. In such a case, what is presented to our mind is not an intelligible nature existing in reality, and undoubtedly grasped and handled by the mind, but without any intuitivity, in the strict sense of the word, on the part of the mind. An analogous remark can be made about definitions. Certain ones share in the natural intuitivity of the abstractive operation, and also in the intuitivity of a more or less extensive sensible experience, which is itself controlled by a more or less extensive knowledge. This is the case for many of the definitions that come to us from the ancients, and whose accuracy is due to the natural candor of the intelligence. Other definitions, which do not share in any way in the intuitivity of the abstractive operation, can have no value for the mind, either because they are badly constructed, or because they refer to a conceptual object that has been artificially formed, and wrongly so. Judgment and Intuitivity.
Let us now consider the second operation of the mind, judgment. Without referring to the intuition of being or of the first principles, it is the intuitive character of certain judgments that I would like to take note of. Above all, those that are at the origin of the great scientific reforms. For a long period, the mind had made progress by following the paths of a commonly accepted system of ideas. Beginning at some given moment, usually following the discovery of new facts, the rational explanations that had been proposed met with greater difficulties and became more complicated. At the same time, a certain disquiet or malaise slipped unconsciously into scholarly thought. So it came about that in the minds of research scholars, totally new ideas sprang up, which completely overturned the long-accepted notions and demanded the elaboration of a new system of ideas. Think, for example, of the Copernican revolution in astronomy, Einstein's introduction of the physics of relativity, Freud's introduction of the psychology of the subconscious, or the arrival of the idea of evolution, especially in biology, but also in cosmology.
How can we describe what happens in such cases? It seems to me that in the minds of such scholars, uneasy both about reality itself and about the explanations of that reality, a kind of toppling of the old regime took place from the very start. Instead of first turning their gaze toward those conceptual constructions that they sought to set up, and toward those rationally satisfying conclusions that would be drawn from a sequence of rational arguments, it was instead toward reality, toward what is, that scholars turned their gaze exclusively, looking at things in a new way, forgetting for the moment the accepted explanations. Each one looked at the world, or more exactly their particular world, the one which is the proper object of their particular science. And of course, they did not see it, either with the eyes of their body or with those of their mind. When I say that they look at reality, I mean that, leaving aside in the area of their interest the system of commonly accepted rational explanations, they ask themselves, what is actually taking place in reality? How do things behave in concrete existence? To answer such a question, they put aside the commonly accepted system of rational explanations, but they keep in their head everything they know from other sources and consider as certain, and they concentrate their thought on the ensemble of facts related to their field of interest. An ensemble of facts which, as characteristics of reality, or of that world toward which they are turned, they look at, but cannot see. These facts become for them a kind of masked substitute for that vision refused to the human intellect, and turn into so many enigmas to which they must find the key. With regard to the agent or illuminating intellect lodged in the supraconscious of the mind, it seems to me that all the factual data considered in this way play a role in some ways analogous to that of the species impressa, received from the imagination, under the action of the agent intellect, through the faculty of intellectual knowledge. I do not mean that the agent intellect, after having drawn from those facts on which the scholar has concentrated their thought, some kind of species impressa informing the intellectual faculty, would bring about the production by the latter of a mental word. Certainly not. What I think is that, under the action of the illuminating intellect, it comes about that from the simple rapprochement of certain of these facts, and without any rational or discursive process, there spring up like sparks. First a new image in the creative imagination toward which the mind turns, and then a new assertion in the intelligence which changes the entire system of ideas accepted up to that time. This is a judgment which, far from being a conclusion drawn from reasoning, is due to the mind's intuitivity, and bursts forth in a flash of intuitivity, even though it might bring certitude to the mind of the person in which it is produced, and because of which everything that once troubled their intelligence now suddenly receives complete satisfaction. That certitude remains hypothetical with regard to science as long as factual observations have not confirmed it. It is in this way that the observations carried out by Galileo on the satellites of Jupiter, the rotation of the sun on its axis, and the phases of Venus established the necessity of replacing the Ptolemaic system of the world by the Copernican system. I think that in the mind of Copernicus himself, the assertion that the earth revolves about the sun started out as one of the intuitive judgments I just mentioned, which brought its own certitude to the mind in which it burst forth. Reasoning and Intuitivity. Finally, let us move on to the third operation of the mind. What I would like to point out above all is a paradox which it seems to me is not ordinarily given sufficient emphasis, namely, that for a science to be established and developed in the human mind, a science that is destined to make continual progress, the intuitivity of the intelligence and the discourse of reason must not cease to control one another under different relationships. Let me first have recourse to one of those more or less limping comparisons I am so fond of. However much they may limp, they help me to think. Suppose we imagine an explorer who has to travel through a strange country. He prepares the first stage of his journey in his head by determining with the help of his compass and the stars the direction he is going to take. Perhaps he has in hand, too, some rather inaccurate map drawn up long ago by his predecessors. This preparation is a work of the rational order.
But before committing himself and his party to the chosen direction, he sends ahead a few members of his expedition to reconnoiter the terrain. They discover that by following the direction he has decided upon, they run up against a mountain lake or a vast swamp. There can be no question of going ahead without the whole troop with its vehicles and baggage being lost in that lake or bogged down in the swamp. The explorer receives the information discovered by the reconnaissance team, information which depends on the external senses and is of an experiential intuitive order. So he sends out a group of cartographers to join the reconnaissance team. Their job is to determine rationally and verify the information furnished by the reconnaissance team by transcribing signs marked down exactly on paper according to the laws of cartographic projection. This rational rectification completes the ancient imperfect map, which the explorer perhaps has at his disposition, and permits him to establish a map which later on anyone else can make use of, thanks to the notional signs that it provides. So naturally he decides to change direction in order to bypass the obstacle. In this way, at the end of his expedition, he will have traced out, by means of cartographic signs, the entire route he followed, and which others will be able to follow after him. To my way of thinking, this route traced out on the map is the symbol of what, in some area of its research, any science at all, at a given point in its development, will have won from the land of the unknown.
Let us note in passing that the completed sketch of the route, which from now on can be viewed in its entirety on paper, could be considered by those who later on make use of this map as due solely to the work of cartographers. But in reality, the map makers would not have been able to carry out their work of a rational order, except for the work done beforehand by the reconnaissance team that explored the terrain. This work of an experiential intuitive order, in a certain respect, was determined and verified rationally by the cartographers. On the other hand, let us not forget the work of a rational order of the explorer, when he determined the original direction, and when later on each change in direction was clarified and verified. In another respect, by the work the reconnaissance team carried out, with the help of its physical senses and its intuitivity. A completely abstract epistemology too often forgets or neglects, on behalf of rational discourse, those aspects of the constitution of a science which depend on the intuitivity of the mind. An existential epistemology owes it to itself to give both intuitivity and reason their due. In addition, we can say that both intuitivity and reason play an essential role in established science, when that science is a habitus that is truly exercised and lived in act and capable of making progress, just as they do in science when it is in the process of being established. But that the role of intuitivity is more apparent in this latter form of science, and the role of reason more apparent in established science. So then, in the work by which any science is elaborated and lived out in act by the mind, and by which it advances, the intuitivity of the intellect is controlled by reason in a certain respect, i.e., with respect to the exactness or correctness of its conceptualization and the rigor of its logical inferences, and the discourse of reason is controlled by the intuitivity of the intellect in another respect, i.e., with respect to reconnoitering the terrain. In other words, with respect to changes in direction to which, at certain junctures along the path of its progress, rational discourse is obliged to make by the glance that the mind's intuitivity constantly casts on reality. It is in this sense that, in my opinion, the law enunciated by St. Thomas must be understood. The reasoning process always begins with the intellect and ends with the intellect. For it is certainly not enough to say that the discourse of reason begins with the first self-evident principles, and ends up in those conclusions, which a well-conducted rational discourse has made evident in their turn, as if one could elicit an entire philosophy, as Parmenides tried to do, from the principle of identity, which in itself undoubtedly presupposes the intuition of being, but which, like the other first principles, is essentially concerned with the logical connections among concepts, which have these first principles as their ultimate rule. Let us say rather that the discourse of reason always begins with something seen by the intellect, either in a previously established conclusion or in a rationally controlled judgment of intuitivity, and always ends up with something intuitively seen by the intellect in a correctly established conclusion. I just mentioned those junctures of rational discourse in which the intuitive glance cast by the mind on reality obliges reason to change direction along the path it is following. How can I best describe a little more precisely what I understand by this, and which is an entirely different intuitive process than the one concerned with the second operation of the mind, and those discoveries which bring about the reform or renewal of science? I would say that if reason is attentive solely to its own constructive power, to the pursuit and development of the logical sequences of its concepts, and to the growing multiplicity of conclusions which, if I may put it this way, it is its job to breed, it may very well, once rational discourse has headed down a certain path, find itself at some point in time tempted to ignore some fact or some existential datum, which it would indispensably have to take into account in order to arrive at the truth, and which would oblige that rational discourse to branch off in a new direction. It is at such a moment, at such a juncture in its discourse, that reason, in order to catch its breath, as I just said, with something intuitively seen by the needs a warning coming from the mind's intuitivity, which in this particular respect is in control of reason. If this intuitivity is unceasingly on its guard, as it should be, then the intellect, as it advances rationally step by step, at the same time keeps its glance ever turned toward reality, which it would like to see, but cannot see, as our eyes see it. It is by means of the imagination that the intellect endeavors to picture reality to itself, to see it. In this way, the role of the imagination from then on appears to be essential in a process which I consider primarily negative. While the discourse of reason unfolds, and in accord with the conclusions posited by reason, the imagination, illuminated like the intelligence by the agent intellect, constantly creates representations and images, however schematic and barely sketched out they may be. And when there is question of completely spiritual matters, whose concept is analogical, however purely symbolic they may be, by means of these representations and images, the intuitivity of the mind looks at reality which it also cannot see as our eyes see it. The fact that at a given moment the image thus created finds itself in conflict with a fact, an existential truth, which we know in some other way, either by sensible experience or by some science or other, or by some connatural knowledge, even if this were still unconscious, or by theology, by an article of faith or scriptural text, a fact which reason neglects to take into consideration, the intuitivity of the mind. Turn toward this image in order to look at reality by means of that image. Nihil sine phantasmate, intelligit anima. Immediately confronts that image with a categorical no. No. It is not possible that things happen in this way. And at the same time, it opposes a categorical no to the conclusion that reason has posited or is about to posit, and which is expressed by the image in question. There is no logical inference here. There is a refusal of the intuitive order, a judgment of intuitivity, which, once under the control of reason in a fitting relationship, obliges reason to take account of the existential truth, which it took the risk of ignoring, and so forces rational discourse to take another direction. It is as if, before permitting the positing of a conclusion toward which rational discourse seems to be leading, the intuitivity of the mind sets out ahead, thanks to imaginary models through which it looks at reality, on a sort of trial run of this conclusion, on some concrete existential reality. Shall we look for an example to illustrate what I just said? Here is one that comes from metaphysics and concerns the agent intellect. In showing that in order to take account of the human intellectual operation, which supposes an abstract species impressa of the data of the imagination interiorizing the data of the external senses, it is necessary to posit an actuating cause, a cause that is above the knowing intellect, intellectus possibilis, which is capable of becoming all things, which is itself above the imagination, which in turn is above the external senses, an actuating cause, that is, which makes the intelligence become the thing known, and which is the illuminating intellect, ever in act, by Aristotle had imprinted on rational discourse, a direction toward what is higher, toward the transcendent, which according to Avicenna and Averroes, who read Aristotle from the perspective of his Greek commentators, reason continued to pursue, by positing the existence of a separated intellect, which is the same for all men.
Whence, pursuing its flight into the sublime, reason must conclude that this separated and universal intellect is God himself, who by his universal radiance causes the act of intellection in the human intellect, and in making of this human intellect the place or the mirror of the intelligibles, leads it back little by little to the land of the pure spirits to which it belongs by nature.
Then let us put ourselves for the moment where reason is all set to posit the existence of a single, identical, separated intellect, common to all men. What image will reason make use of to express this eventual conclusion? With my taste for naive sketches, I would have imagined, for example, an immense sheet of light formed by the rays of the sun, of all intellects falling upon and penetrating each individual of the human race, so that inside his head, it might unwrap the intelligible from its sensible packaging and cause the act of intellectual knowledge to take place within that man. Now suppose that such an image is presented to my intelligence, which is turned toward reality, looking at reality, and making use of the imagination to represent this reality to itself, because it cannot see the way my eyes see. I say that the response will be immediate. No, that cannot be. I am the one who produces my act of intellection. That God may move me to cause this act, so be it. But I am the one who causes it within me. I am the one who does the thinking. It is impossible that the intellect by whose action, in light, I think should be separate from myself. This no, like a flash of lightning, envelops a judgment of intuitivity, which reason will control in the relationship which concerns it, and it will transform it into a rationally established assertion. Each of us is a human person, master of his actions, and consequently equipped to produce them. And it is this judgment of intuitivity which obliges rational discourse to change direction, to reshuffle its cards and fall back on the human subject and its individual soul, instead of continuing to ascend toward heaven. It is in the heaven of each individual soul that the agent intellect is lodged. It is not the individual soul that it transcends. It is all the other powers in that soul which are concerned with knowledge. It is not the sun of all intellects. It is a light continuously in act within the mind of each one. Why am I persuaded that a judgment of intuitivity of this kind arose in the mind of St. Thomas himself, concerning the question of the agent intellect? Because on the one hand, we know that this question is centrally important to his entire thought. By making the illuminating intellect come down into each individual soul, he affirmed in a very decisive way his aversion for all Platonic or Plotinian idealism, as well as his realist conception of the human person, and in general, of the creature, in its relationship to God, who moves it to act, but gives it in creating it the complete equipment required by its nature. And he has such respect for his creatures that when there is question of a free creature, it can turn away from him by a first initiative of nothingness. And because, on the other hand, there is nothing in what St. Thomas expounds on the subject of the agent intellect that makes the central importance of this question in the Thomas synthesis stand out, except perhaps in the eyes of someone who is already aware of it. If we read the commentary on the De Anima and the Summa Theologiae, we see only the rational discussion and demonstration unfold with regard to this particular problem, as with all the other problems. A tapestry of arguments, which is woven continuously stitch by stitch. Nevertheless, St. Thomas was certainly conscious of the central importance of the position he was defending on this particular point. So it must be that St. Thomas himself saw this importance in a different way, a way that is hidden from us in the letter of his text, but which it is up to us to discover. I mean by a judgment of intuitivity. But the pure objectivity which the angelic doctor considered as requisite for his function as teacher of theology, forbade him to carry such a judgment over to his text before it became, once it was under the control of reason, a rational truth. Here, as is the case with all our old masters, it is like a trick which cartography played on what I just now called the reconnoitering of the terrain. It would be too naive to let ourselves be taken in by this trick. Great philosophic minds. A few more words concerning the reciprocal control of intuitivity by reason and of reason by intuitivity. I suggested in another essay that we give the name boldness of gaze to that cardinal quality of the intelligence which corresponds to intuitivity, and which is the basic property of the intellect as intellect, and that we give the name rational solidity to that quality which corresponds to the constructive power of the intelligence in the logical handling of concepts and the discourse of reason. Here, we have to do with the characteristic property of the intellect as a human intellect. It happens naturally that in the case of one or other of the philosophers, one of these two qualities takes predominance over the other, but without ever obliterating the other completely. From this point of view, what must be said of the father of modern philosophy? He had some powerful intuitions, relating especially to the work to which he was called. He preferred good common sense, or reason in the state of nature, to scholarly reason, and he took clear ideas for sorts of quasi-angelic atoms of evidence. Yet it was rational solidity, the power of constructivity, and the ardor of reason to set up assemblages of clear ideas which predominated in him. Cogito, ergo sum. The intuition of being is not present at the beginning of his philosophy, but rather one of those assemblages, a condensed argument of reason, a fact attested by consciousness, I think, and an inference. Therefore, I am. He deduces his existence from his thought. With Descartes, reason is not controlled by the intuitivity of the mind turned toward the real, since the mind is turned solely toward itself. The philosopher remains shut up within his thought. Clear ideas suffice for everything. It is at the level of reason that what is held to be true must be adjusted. Reason is controlled only by itself, by its own power of constructivity, its own ease and satisfaction in putting together conceptual clarities, its own fecundity in conclusions linked one to the other, and forming a system, to such a point that they constitute the universal science. It is no wonder, then, that the greatest of the sons of Descartes, however displeased he was with his father, should dream, as he wiped clean the lenses of his spectacles, of constructing a purely deductive metaphysical wisdom. Nor is there any reason to wonder at the errors and illusions which proliferate within Cartesian philosophy itself. The theory of innate ideas, idea pictures which are the objects of knowledge, and whose divine veracity guarantees their resemblance to the real that is hidden behind them. The dualism which divides man into subsistent thought and subsistent extension, and which makes the soul an angel dwelling in a machine and directing it by means of the pineal gland. The theory of the animal machine. The theory of time as a succession of discontinuous instants. The theory of judgment as function of the will. The ontological argument which claims to prove the existence of God solely by the idea of the perfect or of the infinite, and all the rest. And above all, the idealist prejudice in which this philosophy has fixed modern thought. And what about Hegel? He had a primordial intuition, the intuition of the mobility and anxiety essential to human life, the intuition of the tragic becoming of a living being who is obliged unceasingly to contemplate death and negativity and to overcome their power by the energy of thought. But at the same time, he carried idealism to the absolute by denying all extra mental reality and by making of reality, of nature, of history, of the world, a manifestation of thought within itself, or of spirit discursively thinking itself, in such a way that, to tell the truth, the magnum opus of Hegel was to bring about the violation of the concept and of reason by reality, such as he perceived it in his primordial intuition, and to introduce becoming into the concept itself, and contradiction into reason itself. Reason seeks out its other, knowing full well that there it possesses nothing more than itself. It is solely in quest of its own infinity. The concept, which is no longer a sign making a nature, discerned in the thing, known and intelligible, but the self-affirmation of thought, envelops and engenders the other to what it posits. The no is present in the yes, and the yes in the no, as Jacob Boehme put it, with this difference, that for Boehme it was a question of a mystical experience, for Hegel an axiom of reason, the identity of identity and non-identity. It is as if all of Heraclitus, distilled into a powerful alcohol, passed over into Parmenides to intoxicate and overpower him. Let me use another expression of Hegel regarding truth. In a bacchanalian revel, where not a single member is sober. At the same time, dialectics becomes knowledge, the only authentic form of knowledge. And reason is freed of absolutely any control by the intuitivity of the mind turned toward reality, since there is no longer absolutely any extra mental reality to which thought has to conform. As a matter of fact, Hegel remained in communication with the extra mental being whose existence he denied, with everything that experience, knowledge, and history brought him, and which he preyed upon with a superb power of poetic intuition. But this was not at all so, that the intuitivity of the mind turned toward reality might control rational discourse. On the contrary, it was in order to transport all that into the world of pure thought and re-engender it there, in order to drag all that into a Bacchic revel of dialectics transformed into metaphysics, leading oppositions and logical self-mutations in the assault on heaven and the earth. From then on, reason was controlled only by itself, by its own power of constructivity, carried now to the infinite, by its own satisfaction in raising ever higher the ambition to lay hold, in its elan toward the supreme affirmation of itself, on the entire universe of knowledge, and by accomplishing this to foster the illusion of having transferred to universal wholes, the singularity, the personality, the liberty which, in the dialectic of the Logos, have been torn away from their proper place in the individual. And in this way, absolute knowledge, in which divine thought and human thought are identical, is consummated in the sage, whereas God, after having alienated himself from himself in the world, reintegrates himself there in himself, and there brings all things back to himself through man and human thought. Thanks to a shell game which shifted all of reality into the dialectic movement immanent to thought, and integrated the irrational into reason, Hegel has led us to the absolute triumph of rationalism, and at the same time to its ultimate bankruptcy, in which we see philosophy as the third essential stage, after art and religion, in the development of the absolute spirit, actually to be nothing more than a grand sophistry, passing itself off as supreme wisdom.
One final and parenthetical remark about Hegel. When we hear him rise up and protest against the distinction between the spiritual and the temporal, and tell us that in its finished form, secular life is the positive and definite embodiment of the spiritual kingdom, or when he declares that God must be conceived as spirit in the community, for it is only there that he knows himself, or that the march of God in the world, that is what the state is, or that, since the state is mind objectified, it is only as one of its members that the individual himself has objectivity, genuine individuality, and an ethical life. When he explains to us that man must take possession of his divinity in this world and in this life at the end of the work of history, Jesus being the first among us to realize that he was God, because God and man at the same time become God and man, in such a way that Christianity does not succeed in being what it really is, in truly realizing itself, except by ceasing to be religion, or represented in myths, in order to become philosophy, in the sense of absolute knowledge, by understanding that there is no world beyond, no afterlife, and no other world than this world. And again, when he explains to us that the men who have been the instruments of history, even if they had necessarily to trample down many an innocent, are justified in the end because history is the judgment of God, the history of the world, the tribunal which judges the world. Weltgeschichte ist Weltgericht. Hegel then appears to us as the prophet of many of the aspects of our age and its mentality. The fact is, there are two kinds of prophets. Those who, like the prophets of Israel, are connatural with the Spirit of God and His freedom, and who in general are not very easy on the world, and those who are connatural to what Hegel himself calls the spirit of the world. And how is this so? Because of an intuitivity which, with its ear cocked for anything which, at a given epoch, moves history and culture deep down, and which in reality turns thought, enslaved to time, even when that thought thinks it can attain absolute knowledge on its own, into an echo of the siren song which leads their age astray, a song which is imperceptible to ordinary ears. All that has to be done to make clear what I am trying to say is to recall these few words of Hegel. Napoleon is God manifesting himself. From the higher regions of the universe of the spirit comes the inspiration of the first kind of prophet. From the dark regions of this universe comes the inspiration of the second kind. For these latter prophets, however brilliantly they may fill the stage with their own presence, have made themselves the servants and worshippers of the emperor of this world. But there is something even crazier this time, in the world of human futility. I have in mind the case of a Christian theologian who, instead of studying Hegel with the greatest of critical care and making use of him, of his prophetic instinct, of his ambitions and his errors, to better understand certain aspects of our historical age, would undertake the renewal of theology itself by submitting it to Hegel's inspiration and to his metaphysics, with Hegel as his guide and teacher. Finally, what must be said of Heidegger? With Hegel there was question of reason turned away from reality and controlled by itself alone. With Heidegger, on the contrary, it seems to me we are concerned with an intuitivity which is enamored of reality and renounces reason. An intuitivity which also wants to be subject to no control but its own. Moreover, we are not concerned here with that intuitivity of which I spoke at length a few pages back. An intuitivity which, with its gaze fixed firmly on things, was in quest of that pure objectivity, characteristic of the intellect, operating according to laws that are strictly its own, and committed to the ways of knowledge. Heidegger is concerned with poetic intuitivity, as is Hegel, and also with an intuitivity that depends on natural mysticism. In both cases, intuitivity plays an essential role, whether, as in the case of poetry, the other and the self are grasped indissolubly together in an experience which proceeds from affective connaturality and is essentially creative. Or, as in the case of natural mysticism, the soul empties itself of everything to attain the existence of the self and to be enraptured by it. This is the kind of intuitivity which, I believe, comes into play with Heidegger, and refuses any control by reason in this connection, and in relation to the exigencies which are proper to reason. But because Heidegger is a philosopher, whether he likes it or not, the intuitivity in question is passionately in search of being, even though it is foreign to the intuition of being, which is of the purely intellectual order. And because even as he deposes reason, Heidegger still remains under the influence of and in allegiance to Hegel, and holds fast to his ambition to attain, if not an absolute knowledge like Hegel's, at least a wisdom which fulfills the aspirations of the mind. Intuitivity, in his case, takes on the whole work of conceptualization, which, beginning with the very first operation of the mind, follows its course normally in that more and more ample constructivity in which discursive reason has its domain.
I think that here we are at the root of the Heideggerian tragedy. For if poetic intuitivity, and undoubtedly also the intuitivity which comes from natural mysticism, is wonderfully profound in him, the fact remains that to expect from poetic intuitivity the elaboration of philosophic concepts and their organization into a formal body of knowledge is to ask the impossible. This is so, on the one hand, because of the pure objectivity required of philosophic concepts. On the other hand, because poetic intuition is a creative intuition, and because the expression that it demands is by its very nature a work of art, not of knowledge. It is essential for this expression to manifest the self and the other together, and this thanks to the creative imagination. The other cannot be shown in this form of expression, except in the experience of the self who undergoes that experience and knows it through affective connaturality. If someone wants to turn the expression of a poetic intuition into a philosophic expression, which implies its detachment both from the experience of the self and from the primacy of the creative imagination, that expression will by the very fact become relatively weightless, or rather lose that intimate and living norm which constitutes its exactness and its truth. If such a metaphysical conceptualization is demanded of poetic intuitivity itself, its ideas will be blind, and its words will be irremediably disappointing. Not only will they be diverted from their original meaning, or be hammered out in an artificial manner, but they will not end up saying what the philosopher wants to say. Far from working on intelligible natures grasped in a mental word, thought, Heidegger's obscure Denken, concentrates on what it can still hold on to of the fleeting content of its intuition, when it tries to desubjectivize that intuition before, and for the purpose of, conceptualizing or intellectualizing it in metaphysical terms. It stays put and stirs about in the darkness of night. Indeed, it is inevitable that once this conceptualization has been carried out, the philosopher should resent it as a betrayal of what had been perceived intuitively by them and had moved them in the depths of their being. This is why in the end they must despair of philosophy and of metaphysics. We know that now, and if what I tried to explain is exact, we could have expected it. Heidegger has turned toward the poets themselves and the theogonic powers of their language, hoping to find in them the kind of prophetic revelation, the desire for which seems to have obsessed their mind from the very beginning. Myth is their true native land.
Final remarks. Not a single one of the three philosophers I just spoke of experienced, either formally or virtually, the metaphysical intuition of being. Bergson had it in a virtual manner. He left the tracks a bit in his critique of intelligence and of the concept, but he himself was too intelligent ever really to deny reason. That intuitivity, which was the very life of his thought, was not poetic intuitivity put to work in order to satisfy the desire for a metaphysical wisdom, which is natural to our minds, or in order to nourish the daydreams of a dialectic, which would lead us to absolute knowledge. nor was it fully liberated philosophic intuitivity either, such as a pure intellect would require. But it was an effort of the entire soul toward this intuitivity in its beginning. This is why Bergson was truly a metaphysician. And this is why we are indebted to him for having cried out for all to hear, in the metaphysical desert of our times, the call for that basic renewal which philosophy had been awaiting for 3 centuries. To conclude all the reflections I have proposed in this essay, after all is said and done, maybe I have only battered down doors that already stood open. Let me advance 3 formulas that I consider to have the force of principles. First, all by itself, and without the control of the intuitivity of an intellect that is turned toward reality, the discourse of reason will inevitably go astray, either by failing to branch off when it should, or by heading down the wrong path. All by itself, and without the control of reason over the exactness of its constructions and the rigor of its logical connections, intuitivity will inevitably veer off towards something other than the pure objectivity of the intellect, and consequently conceptualize awry. Secondly, the intuitivity of an intellect turned toward reality is not just some simple individual quality giving an advantage to some thinker or other among all the others. It is necessary to the validity of thought as knowledge. Thirdly, there is no knowledge without intuitivity. On the theory of sets, we should face up right away to an objection. Does not the theory of sets give the lie to what I have just affirmed? This theory represents an extremely important step forward in contemporary science, and it involves no intuitivity whatever. My answer is this. It is quite true that the theory of sets involves no intuitivity, but it does not constitute, nor does it claim to constitute, a way of knowing. It is an instrument of science, not a science. In other words, it consists essentially in the construction of a new language, signifying and regulating the logical operations carried out in the process of reasoning. This new language is at once both perfectly coherent and purely conventional. And what seems quite remarkable to me is that the words which make it up and which are concerned with the logical categories subsuming our thought contents in order to apply their laws to them do not come, as do those of classical logic and its intension secundae, from a reflection on the concepts already formed by the mind through abstraction and the different kinds of knowing in which the mind is engaged. It is rather a priori, by gratuitously posited conventions, that they have been chosen, and that the system of laws which their grammar implies has been elaborated, like an algebraic system invented for its own sake, in an arbitrary, but at the same time a rigorous manner. All this in such a way that, after the simplest possible first conventions have been chosen, the words or logical categories of the new language so constructed, and the laws of its grammar, are capable, or at least they are considered capable of subsuming any thought content whatever, in order to assure or verify its rational correctness. Let us add that, at the very beginnings of the theory, and in the first conventions that were posited, these words themselves, proper to the theory of sets, as a matter of fact, undoubtedly derive from sensible experience by way of abstraction. But this is not what matters, and this is not what gives them their meaning. As a consequence of the conventions posited at the beginning, they impose themselves from above with that kind of gratuity and freedom which is characteristic of a mathematician's way of thinking, especially of the mathematician, seduced by the great modern developments in axiomatics. And because of an exigency of the nature of human thought, they are undoubtedly accompanied in us by concepts, for example, the concept of set, of element, of union, of intersection, of complementation, of relation, of graph, of lattice, etc. But those concepts which underlie them in our minds evoke them, and use them along the way, without having as their purpose to examine them and signify them. In other words, the meaning is attached to these words directly, not through the intermediary of concepts, in such a way that although they are present within us, nevertheless of themselves, I mean for those operations to be carried out, according to the laws of the new language in question, they are not at all necessary. An electronic machine can do perfectly well without them. It is often said that with the theory of sets, we have a new form of logic. This is undoubtedly so, but only if we add that this new logic has nothing in common with classical logic, which focus its gaze on the functioning of thought, the operations of the mind, the intention is intellecti, the univocity and analogicity of the latter, and the words that express them, etc. It has nothing to do with traditional logic other than to point out and regulate the operations to be carried out. The theory of sets is not a science at all, even if only of intentione secundae, like classical logic, which is both science and art. It is uniquely an art, an ars grammatica logica, and it is on this basis that it plays such an important role in modern mathematics, without being itself in any way part of the mathematical sciences. It is strictly an instrument, a logical grammar that these sciences make use of, and which other systems of knowledge can make use of as well. If this logical grammar is used today with such great success by the mathematical sciences, and if it renders them priceless services, it is above all else in what is concerned with the organization, the systematization, the ever broader applications of the sciences, the methods of teaching the sciences, and the extraordinary rapidity with which, thanks to electronic machines, they can carry out immense calculations. In this sense, the sciences are indebted to it for their great progress. But can it be expected of the theory of sets that it be sufficient to lead the mathematical sciences to the discovery of new horizons in new speculative domains? In other words, to help them grow and be renewed in their intrinsic structure, and precisely as systems of knowledge. I have in mind, for example, discoveries such as analytic geometry, or differential calculus and integral calculus, or non-Euclidean geometries, or hyperspatial geometries, or topology. Bringing about discoveries is not the business of logic, especially not the kind we are talking about, from which, because it is entirely conventional, all intuitivity has been eliminated. A mathematician of genius who uses the theory of sets as an instrument and as a logical grammar may very well bring mathematical knowledge to new heights and open new empires to it. But it will not be by virtue of the logical instrument they made use of, but by virtue of their own powers of imagination and intuitivity.
As I just indicated, it is not only to mathematics that the theory of sets brings a new logical instrument, a new ars grammatica logica, since it is independent of the nature of the propositions that it brings into play. In other words, since the thought content which the theory of sets submits to the laws of its logical grammar is, as far as that grammar itself is concerned, entirely indeterminate, it is not at all surprising that this theory should consider itself universally valid. The content in question can be furnished by any science at all, no more necessarily mathematical than physical, astrophysical, biological, etc. In short, other systems of knowledge than mathematical knowledge can pass over or be tempted to pass over into the logical realm of the theory of sets, can make use of or be tempted to make use of this grammar for their own account. I shall come back to this point. Nevertheless, the fact remains that there are two clearly privileged domains of the theory of sets. On the one hand, the mathematical sciences, and on the other hand, and especially so, their application to procedures in the construction of electronic machines, of computers and calculators, for the use of various scholars, in particular of physicists. These machines have many other uses in banks, in big business, etc. But it is the scientific use that interests us here.
At this point, let us note, as a quite remarkable fact, that if in the practical order electronic calculators constitute such a triumph for the theory of sets, that one might be led to believe that the latter had been invented in view of the former. Nevertheless, its birth preceded them in time. Symbolic algebra, founded on the purely speculative level by George Boole, who died in 1864, is quite anterior to the invention of electronic calculators, which would have been impossible without Boole's algebra, along with the study it made possible of the chains of contact of electrical circuits, and along with its binary language, 0 or 1, open or closed, etc. Here we have one of those singular encounters or convergences which are not rare in the history of science, and which can be explained, I believe, because the speculative theory, which comes first, and then its practical application both depend, in the unconscious of the mind, on the same intellectual climate. In the present case, on a fundamentally nominalist intellectual climate. In this way, the theory of sets appears to us as predestined to man's creation of that new species of slaves, henceforth indispensable to civilization. Electronic machines, calculators, computers, logic machines. In other words, a new species preadapted to the thought of a machine. This form of thought remains absolutely incapable of any intuition whatsoever, and of any universal idea formed from the world of experience. It operates exclusively with words, with signs, with orders for the opening and closing of circuits, which human intelligence alone can prepare and transcribe, after long, patient, and meticulous labor, on punch cards or magnetic tapes, which it offers to the machines as food on which the electronic thought of the machine, the prodigiously rapid operations carried out by it, depends, and which are read by the electric reader, which is a peripheral part of the machine. And the response furnished by the machine likewise appears under the form of signs, this time to be deciphered by man, as they are inscribed on punch cards or magnetic tapes, or in the form of typewritten statements, which are typed out automatically.
It is quite clear that a treasure trove of intuitivity, put to work by some science and translated into formulas, can be changed into the food of words and operative signs, which at the start man offers to the machine through the punch cards they have prepared. But it is equally clear that in the entire work accomplished by the machine, or in the entire thought it is capable of, not the slightest intuitivity can enter into play. More and more perfected electronic machines may be invented, which may imitate the human brain by registering sensible data, sensible to animal and man in the proper sense of the term, sensible to the machine only in a metaphorical sense, coming from the external world. But they will never be able to think in the true sense of the word.
On the 3 degrees of abstraction. What I would like to note here rather rapidly is that at each of the 3 degrees of abstraction, or intelligibility recognized by classical logic, we find present and verified that law of intuitivity on which I insisted as necessary for knowledge, but under extremely different forms and modalities. At what I call the pure and simple first degree of abstraction, from which any participation in metaphysical intellection is excluded, stand all the sciences, empiriological and empirio-mathematical, which hold sway over civilization today and make up, along with the mathematical sciences, what current parlance calls science. A good number of our contemporaries, under the influence of positivism and nominalist empiricism, consider them the only form of knowledge that man is capable of. What contributes to their prestige is the enormous practical power they dispense. Concerning the rules to be put in place by human beings in the exercise of such enormous power, they have, in the final analysis, nothing to tell us and do not claim to tell us anything. As a matter of fact, in each nation, the only things that regulate the use of this power are fear of another and avidity for power, along with an unnatural haste for the importance of time for any kind of maturation, even, and especially, in the human and moral order, is completely misunderstood by them. What is involved here, let us not forget it, is as it were the basic barbarism, due to a loss of spiritual center or direction, of the actual social condition of humanity, and not at all the sciences in question, taken in themselves and in their proper dignity as forms of knowledge. In the daily labor and the patient, indefatigable research of men who consecrate themselves to the empiriological and the empirio-mathematical sciences, the intuitivity put into play depends above all on good sense, enlightened and refined by the intelligence. Let us call it intelligentiated sense. The cogitative power, or the ratio particularis, is equally involved. Thus, a kind of flair is developed, along with a kind of connaturality with the world of experience and with the different levels of the material world, which fosters the capacity to perceive signs for the mind in enigmatic form, and to guess at new avenues of approach, and all of which is controlled by admirable habits of exactitude and rigor. In brief, it is through the intuitivity of understanding then that the mind looks at reality and is turned toward the real. If there is question of the great epoch-making discoveries which from age to age renew or revolutionize science, then we must think of something else, of that judgment of intuitivity I tried to explain above. Finally, let us not forget that at the term of scientific reasoning, verification by fact, thanks to observation and experimentation, plays an absolutely indispensable role. Without it, the most astute conceptual constructions remain hypothetical. It is this factual verification which, by confirming the well-founded hypotheses and rejecting the others, establishes science in its proper rank as a form of knowledge. Here once again, the intuition of the intelligentiated sense is at work, this time in a decisive declaration whose conditions have been prepared by the intelligence, and which the intelligence has carried out by means of the intuition of understanding, which has utilized the more and more richly and subtly developed instrumentation of scientific equipment. Those sciences which stand at the pure and simple first degree of abstraction, and the techniques to which they give birth, have set out along the road to making the world subject to man. But the highest horizons of the mind remain closed to them. Other sciences, in this case philosophic, and especially the philosophy of nature, stand also at the first degree of abstraction, but they are at the first level inasmuch as they are participatively illuminated by metaphysical intellection and the intuition of being, which depend on the third degree. More purely speculative than the sciences of nature, the philosophy of nature makes us able to penetrate into the domain of primary truths. It is already a form of wisdom, or rather, it is a door that opens onto wisdom. Its object is still the world of nature and of matter at its different levels, but it looks at this world from an entirely different angle, with a method of approach and an intellectual equipment that is entirely different, which are not shut up within experience, the observable and the measurable, but which stand at the level of being, and of the quest of being as the first principle of intelligibility of what we see, acting and stirring in the world around us. This is why the philosophy of nature knows man, and the things of man in a more perfect and more comprehensive way than do the empiriological sciences which are concerned with the human being. This is also why, at the end of its search, it is led, as was already the case for the physics of Aristotle, to posit the question of the first cause, and to make it clear that in considering nature, human reason naturally
and necessarily comes to the question of the existence of God. Nevertheless, the philosophy of nature and the philosophical sciences which depend on the first degree of abstraction remain and should remain closely linked to their sister sciences, the sciences of nature, whether purely empiriological or mathematicized, not in order that they conform servilely to their type of explanation, which is not philosophical, but in order to understand what it is they bring to us, and then include it in some way in their own philosophical light. The philosophy of nature has a strict obligation to take account of the results and the progress made by the sciences of nature, to whatever type they belong. I have noted elsewhere that on this point the current teaching of the philosophy of nature, for a long time now, has incurred a considerable amount of reproach, and that the Thomist philosophy of nature has urgent need, certainly not to be doctrinally changed, but to be renewed and brought up to date by a much closer contact with a scientific universe which has been completely transformed since the days of St. Thomas.
What a lacuna, for example, when we come to hylomorphism and the theory of corporeal substance. To find in most of the classical expositions no reference whatever to the corpuscular structure or to the quantum structure of matter, which today play such a fundamental role in the science of the physical world. For us, the great challenge is to give a philosophic interpretation to this corpuscular and quantum structure with the imagery that they entail, all of which does nothing to change the philosophical truths recognized by Aristotle and St. Thomas. But this does demand a serious effort at critical elaboration, for which the majority of the most deeply meditative, the best informed, and the freest minds among scientists and among writers deeply interested in science lack the necessary tools, and this challenge inevitably poses for us difficult and complicated problems. I shall limit myself to noting here that since the advent of quantum mechanics, the physicist knows very clearly, just as the philosopher ought to know, that what mathematical physics arrives at is not the thing itself, but rather, if you wish, the modalities of our relations to those things. These relations which things maintain with the observer being expressed by a more and more formalized science in the pure terms of mathematical regularities, while the models or imagery from which they are drawn are put aside as inadequate. In short, what our physics arrives at is an empirical reality whose objectivity is weak. The fact remains that in a non-empirical reality, behind the physicist's symbolic entities, and presupposed by them something else lies hidden, which is not the concern of the physicist as such, so that in listening to the physicist, the philosopher is free to turn his thoughts not so much to what he is talking about, as to the hidden implications of what he is talking about. And so he will say, from his particular point of view, that the different entities of physics necessarily presuppose an objectively strong ontological foundation, implied by the quantification of energy as far as the activity of matter is concerned, by the particles which appear on the screen of scientific imagery as far as its substance is concerned.
From the point of view of the corpuscular structure of matter, it seems reasonable to say that the individual species water is the chemical particle itself, the molecule H2O. On the other hand, in the world of biology, it is the entire living organism which constitutes the individual. Here the microparticles described in scientific imagery as composing the genes, the chromosomes, the cells are, just like the different tissues and organs, ontologically integrated into the unity of a whole. The individual organism, infusoria or elephant, informed even to the smallest corpuscle, discernible in its constitution by a single substantial form, a vegetative soul or a sensitive soul. intellective soul in the case of man. But let us get back to the subject of our concern, the intuitivity which accompanies knowledge. In the case of the kind of philosophic knowledge we are talking about, this form of knowledge does not enjoy the fruits of the intuitivity that is peculiar to the sciences of nature alone. It has its own peculiar intuitivity, philosophic intuitivity, which belongs to the very intellect itself. Regarding the human sciences, which in reality are philosophical sciences and demand to be treated as such, something denied them today. Perhaps it could be said that here too, by reason of that knowledge by connaturality, due to our experience of men and of ourselves, a kind of intellectual flair is developed which plays a very important role in research and discovery. At any rate, it is to the philosophy of nature that I want to give particular attention. Here we are in the domain, long under consideration, of that intuitivity of the mind that is turned toward reality, and which looks at that reality without being able to see it as our eyes do. As I noted, it is by means of the creative imagination, illuminated like the intelligence, and along with it by the light of the agent intellect, that the mind looks at reality in this way. Let it suffice for me to insist here on the importance of a text from St. Thomas that I cited earlier in a footnote. When someone tries to understand something, they form certain phantasms for themselves by way of examples, in which they almost see what they are trying to understand. In these phantasms of the creative imagination, the mind in a certain way sees the real which it strives to understand with the help of the overarching universal concepts that philosophical intellection makes use of. He looks at the real and cannot see it in the way our eyes see it, but he sees it, so to speak, thanks to the imagination. In regard to that intuitivity, peculiar to the philosophy of nature, to which our present reflections are directed, here we are concerned with the intelligentiated imagination, and no longer with the intelligentiated external sense, as we were with regard to the natural sciences. And it is in order that we might intellectually lay hold on the real, to look at, and in a certain way, to see the real, that we make use in this way of this noble and marvelously precious internal sense. With regard to the things which the philosophy of nature wants to scrutinize, the imagination does not present us solely with examples formed from what we already know about those things, either by means of previously acquired philosophical truths, or by means of our philosophical interpretation of scientific data. With images it has created, the imagination constantly reinforces the notions and explanations gradually elaborated in proportion as we make progress in our rational discourse, without ceasing at the same time to be turned toward the real. It is in confrontation with these images that at certain moments, as we have seen, the intellect perceives intuitively that rational discourse has wandered astray into a false theory, or risks doing so, and must be put back on track, so that from a certain point of view, intuitivity is in control of reason. Apropos of this role of the imagination, we might think, for example, not only of Copernicus and Galileo as we did earlier, but also of the discoverers of the idea of evolution, and of those who first denied the fixity of species. The image of a living world traversed throughout the ages by the movement of a creative duration underlay their original intuition, however poorly conceptualized it may have been in the case of Lamarck, with his notion of adaptation to environment, or in the case of Darwin with his notion of natural selection and the life struggle.
Everything concerning the essential role of the intuitivity of the mind and of the intelligentiated imagination, which is already true for the philosophy of nature, must be said a fortiori, and in an incomparably richer and broader perspective, when, moving to the third degree of abstraction, we turn our attention to the case of metaphysics. Metaphysics is the highest form of rational knowledge in its purely natural use, and it is the highest form of knowledge by intuitivity, that knowledge in which the intuitivity of the intellect finds its fullest and most perfect exercise. We know that at its very beginning is found that intuition par excellence, the intuition of being, and that as it advances rational, step by rational step, it is constantly animated and illuminated by this primordial intuition. It is not surprising that because of it, intuitivity and reason control one another, each in a different respect, according to the general schema I have indicated, but with greater amplitude and in a fashion more imperiously imposed than in any other form of knowledge. For thanks to the basic analogicity of being, and to the analogical concepts that nourish it, metaphysics is concerned not only, as is the philosophy of nature, with the realities of the sensible world, but it breathes the air of the higher regions, finds its life in the invisible universe of the mind, and has as its task to come to a knowledge there of those realities which escape the senses and enable us, already even in the purely natural order, to cross the frontiers of the eternal and the divine. At the same time, the images which serve as instruments for its intuitivity are constructed with more freedom, the freedom of the creative imagination in purely symbolic figuration. And the higher the truths which such a knowledge strives to conquer, the greater the risks involved. They demand that here intuitivity and reason be always on the alert.
But there is another matter, and it is very important that it be discussed. When the metaphysical habitus has been developed in man, and when, in particular, it tends above all else toward God and divine things in proportion as the natural forces of human intelligence are capable of gaining access to them, metaphysics opens out on a kind of contemplation that must be called philosophical contemplation, and which, like any contemplation, entails a certain superior kind of intuitivity. I would like to spend a few moments on this matter. I am afraid I may not be up to this task. The vocabulary that must be used will certainly cause us many a headache. But we must try. Let us note immediately that this philosophical contemplation borders on two other kinds of contemplation. That contemplation proper to supernatural mysticism, and that proper to natural mysticism, between which a careful distinction must be made. These three types of contemplation may very well, in certain individual cases, be subject to some mixing together. In themselves and by their essence, they are totally different. The contemplation proper to supernatural mysticism is an entry into God's depths, by the knowledge of connaturality which is due to the love of charity, and to the gifts of the Holy Spirit, above all to the gift of wisdom. The contemplation proper to natural mysticism is a purely intellectual experience of the essence of the self, obtained through the void, the abolition of concepts and a turning back toward unknowing. Philosophical contemplation is likewise a purely intellectual contemplation, but a positive one without any turning back of the natural drive toward knowledge. Do, when the mind is fixed on them so that it may be absorbed into them, to those analogical concepts, thanks to which we know God per speculum, in enigmate, through a mirror, in an enigma. How can such a knowledge by analogy pass over into a state of contemplation? And how can it, at the same time, imply a certain higher element of intuitivity? I shall try, as far as I am able to answer these questions. Let us recall two assertions by St. Thomas that I had the occasion to cite in an earlier chapter. In the Summa Theologiae, he tells us apropos of the analogical intellection and the analogical concepts which we use to name God, non secundum eamdem, rationem, hoc nomen sapiens, de Deo et de homine dititur. We are using one and the same analogical concept, sapiens. But it is definitely not according to the same ratio, or with the same intelligible extension, that this concept designates what is in God, divine wisdom, and what is in the creature, so that the wisdom of man is indeed the mirror, or the resemblance by which we know the wisdom of God. But this mirror is so enigmatic and the resemblance so distant and deficient that the wisdom of God is something entirely different from, infinitely other than, man's wisdom, thanks to which we are able to know and name it by analogy. In other words, our concept of wisdom and our name for it, when they are applied to God, leave the signified reality deep within its unfathomable mystery, beyond, infinitely beyond, our understanding, and exceeding or surpassing, infinitely surpassing, the signification of the word.
It seems to me that these two assertions, if we reflect on them with sufficient attention, furnish us the keys we are looking for.
The created analogate is the mirror in which we come to know, but enigmatically, the uncreated analogate. When a philosopher is not satisfied simply to name some uncreated perfection or other, and gives it a hasty tip of his hat, before passing on to the next, but instead he sets himself to meditate on it, and what he knows of divine things, he comes to realize that his intelligence and all his ideas are completely outstripped by them and prove totally disproportionate to them. The more he focuses his mind on the ideas that help him come to some knowledge of God, the deeper experience he has of the devouring power of that outstripping and of that disproportion, as well as of that dark night, in which, at the very instant here below, when the signs that proceed from him enable us to utter his name, God hides himself from our human eyes. The experience I'm speaking of does not refer to the object, to God himself. It refers to something created, to what goes on in the mind of the philosopher, on the outstripping of all his ideas, and on the disproportion which affects them with regard to the divine reality. He has no experience of the depths of God as St. John of the Cross did. He has rather the experience of his own congenital infirmity as a creature before his Creator, whom he seeks to know. And the deeper this experience is for him, the greater value and splendor it gives to the analogical concept he has of God's grandeur. But he knows that this concept, too, is completely inadequate. And all the more inadequate, the more his mind is absorbed in this concept. Here is how I picture knowledge by analogy becoming philosophical contemplation, a completely intellectual form of contemplation, which may certainly be accompanied by a feeling of natural love for God, but which in itself is not a contemplation of love. It would rather be a contemplation of fear and trembling, which seems to me to be very close to adoration. Let me note parenthetically that adoration, which is also related to the grandeur of God and to the mystery which envelops him, has its origin, it seems to me, in natural religion, which undoubtedly has never existed among men in its pure state, but which, like in filigree, shines through all the religions of humanity. Adoration is not a theological virtue like charity. I believe that it is an essentially human and natural virtue, of which man will never completely rid himself, even when he turns it toward false gods, which are always at hand, or even when he turns it into blasphemy. Now, what must be said of that element of intuitivity, which is as inseparable from philosophical contemplation as it is from any other form of contemplation? I just noted that the experience which constitutes philosophical contemplation does not have to do with God himself, but rather with what takes place in the knowing subject, and with the disproportion of his concepts with regard to the very object that he knows. This is exactly how it is with the element of intuitivity we are speaking about at the moment. And yet in this case we must go much further, for the intuitivity of the mind in some way or other, always has some relation to the object known. So in this case, it must have some kind of relation to God himself. How can this be? I say that it is in an indirect manner, and by a sort of reversion onto the object, where there is a change of sign, of a negative datum present in the knowing mind. Inasmuch as it designates a certain created analogate, wisdom in man, for example, the analogical concept embraces and circumscribes this created analogate. But this perfection in God is altogether different from what is found in man. And just how it is entirely different in God, or by what splendors it is so, or the way in which in the divine reality it escapes our understanding, and outstrips, infinitely outstrips, the signification of the name, all of this remains strictly unknown to us. And in this respect, we can do no more than stammer out concepts that are equally disproportionate and outstripped by their object, over the very thing that is properly divine in the divine perfection that we come to know. There is cast a veil of unknowing. In other words, the analogical concepts by which we know God and divine things bring us at the same time both knowledge and nescience. And the better we come to know God, the more we realize that our lack of knowledge in his regard remains far more profound and vast than our knowledge.
But then, is not this gnawing negativity, this unknowing which accompanies and invincibly overflows the knowledge of the knowing subject by the very fact a reverse image of something infinitely positive in God? Is it not the negative image in us of the divine sublimity? As I see it, this is what the intuitivity of the mind seizes upon immediately, in an instantaneous perception. Through this instantaneous perception, which brings about a change of sign, the negative datum, or that invincible nescience which remains in the knowing subject and of which he is conscious, is turned back onto the divine object, and in this way makes manifest the eternal perfection in God, of which the reverse image I spoke of is the sign in us. Undoubtedly we already have the idea or the analogous concept of the divine sublimity, but the intuitivity of the Spirit, by means of the reversion that it brings about, illumines this idea and makes it all the more resplendent, in such a way that the dazzled intellect plunges into it, as into a luminous abyss, which overflows in all directions.
In my opinion, this is how that element of intuitivity, linked to philosophical contemplation, in a certain way, bears on the divine object itself. By fixing our mind on the divine sublimity, and absorbing our mind in that sublimity. And despite all this philosophical contemplation, does not prove unfaithful to its nature, as a purely intellectual contemplation by means of ideas, and it does not enter into the depths of God by supraconceptual experience or the connaturality of love, as is the case with supernatural mystical contemplation. It could be said that at its highest point, philosophical contemplation is also an apophatic contemplation, at least in the sense that the concepts which bring about this knowledge always play an essential role, but admit to being vanquished, just as the intellect in adoration admits to being vanquished when it fixes its gaze and attention on those concepts. Be silent. Poor human mind. I would add that the element of unknowing I spoke of as presupposed by the intuitivity proper to philosophical contemplation, being as it is the supreme fruit of the knowledge of God by analogy, evidently has nothing to do with that form of unknowing by means of the abolition of all concepts and by the creation of the void within the soul, which we come across in the typical forms of natural mysticism. Finally, with regard to the second degree of abstraction, the one that is proper to the mathematical sciences, I have a prefatory remark to make first. Up to the present, when I spoke of the intuitivity of the mind, I always added, the intuitivity of the mind turned toward the real, because what I was first and foremost concerned with was philosophical knowledge. But in the case of the mathematical sciences, it is not toward the real, but toward beings of reason, that the mind and its intuitivity are turned, separated from corporeal substance and from the world of sensible experience by an abstraction which, this time, isolates its object from the real and recasts it in an idealist manner. Extension and quantity actually constitute for thought a multiform noetic universe apart, which infinitely overflows the conditions proper to the world of matter, such as it exists in reality, and such as our senses and our intellect lay hold on it at the first degree of abstraction. This multiform and teeming universe, not of existing things, but of pure objects of thought, on the one hand, is constructed by the mind with regard to the manner in which it takes form, beginning with the abstraction, which draws out the first principles of things, and at the same time is independent of the mind with regard to its properties. Some basic quiddity, or basic definition, or other, having been first freely posited, constitutive of some branch or other of the mathematical sciences, because this is a universe of pure, rational necessities. The ideal entities which compose them have their own consistency and their own structures that are just as firm, and their own laws which are just as inflexible as those of the real world. So that if it is true to say that the mind freely causes them to appear before it, it is equally true to say that they unveil themselves to the mind that explores them. It is as if from the ocean of the imagination, the intellect, with a wave of a magic wand, causes islands to emerge, or archipelagos, or mountains covered with eternal snows, which have no existence except as ideals or as pure objects of thought, which the mind sets itself to scrutinize. There are no sciences freer than the mathematical sciences, which in a sense create their own objects, as is the case with art. But they are not forms of art. They remain sciences, whose truth consists in conformity, if not to existing things, at least to pure objects of thought which, once their ideal existence has been posited, depend solely on that ideal existence for their entire logical development and all their properties. This is a type of knowledge that is completely foreign to physics, since it is concerned with a purely ideal object, but which is a marvelous instrument of physics. It could even happen that some sector or other of this universe of beings of reason, non-Euclidean spaces, for example, would have to be considered. I do not say as presenting us with characteristics of the real world. I do not think that by confusing geometry and physics, one can declare that what is called, at the first degree of abstraction, the extension of corporeal things, of the plains, of the seas, from all of which, at the second degree of abstraction, geometry draws forth the primordial notion of space by the natural process of the formation of ideas, constitutes a Riemannian space. I would say rather that Riemannian space can and ought to be considered as ideally applicable, according to the needs of the physical theory, to the real world, and as permitting a more satisfactory explanation of certain aspects of that real world.
But let us leave all that aside. What I consider essential to notice here is that, at the second degree of abstraction, the intuitivity of the mind, turning its attention this time not to reality, even if by means of the imagination, but to this or that system of ideal entities which the mathematical imagination gives rise to. Here, too, plays a fundamental, indispensable role in knowledge. And since there is question here of ideal systems which, however consistent they may be in themselves, are created by the mathematical imagination, is not our concern here above all with an intuitivity of the artistic or aesthetic order, integrity, consonance or harmony, splendor or clarity? Is it not because the mathematician is in search of these three elements, typical of beauty, to which their soul is interiorly attuned, that they suddenly see a principle of intelligible fecundity and intelligible organizing power open up to their particular science new horizons and new avenues of approach to a higher synthesis. Here I find perfectly sufficient the testimony of an eminent scholar in a mathematical area for which, despite my incompetence, I have a particular reverence: topology, which Leibniz, who conceived the idea, called analysis situs. Much later, Riemann won for it its scientific status, and which studies the relative positions of geometrical entities, not by means of number and measurement, but solely in their qualitative properties, or their ordered relationships. The first essential bond between mathematics and the arts, wrote Marston Morse, is found in the fact that discovery in mathematics is not a matter of logic. It is rather the result of mysterious powers which no one understands, and in which the unconscious recognition of beauty must play an important part. Out of an infinity of designs, a mathematician chooses one pattern for beauty's sake and pulls it down to earth. No one knows how. Afterwards, the logic of words and of forms sets the pattern right. Only then can one tell someone else. The first pattern remains in the shadows of the mind.
Apropos of these shadows of the mind, and the sparks of intuitivity which flash forth from them, Morse cites the examples of the discoveries made by Henri Poincaré and by Gauss. Gauss tells how he came to establish a theorem which had baffled him for 2 years. Gauss writes, "Finally, 2 days ago, I succeeded, not on account of my painful efforts, but by the grace of God. Like a sudden flash of lightning, the riddle happened to be solved. I myself cannot say what was the conducting thread, which connected what I previously knew with what made my success possible. Mathematics," Marston Morse continues, "is the sister, as well as the servant of the arts, and is touched with the same madness and genius. The creative scientist lives in the wildness of logic, where reason is the handmaiden and not the master. I shun all monuments that are coldly legible. I prefer the world where the images turn their faces in every direction, like the masks of Picasso. It is the hour before the break of day, when science turns in the womb. And, waiting, I am sorry that there is between us no sign and no language, except by the mirrors of necessity. I am grateful for the poets who suspect the twilight zone." You will notice that mathematical intuitivity is not poetic intuitivity, for in the latter, it is the subject and the object, the self of the poet and the world, which are revealed together to the mind, whereas the intuitivity of the mathematician is of a wholly objective order, as is the case with the intuitivity of the mind in any knowledge properly so called. This is why when he speaks of mysterious powers which no one understands, and on which mathematical discovery depends, Marston Morse is perfectly correct to add that the unconscious recognition of beauty must play a major role here. Fascination with the beauty within the object, an object that is completely ideal, and not that creative emotion, that secret depth of connaturality between things, and that subjectivity which makes the poet a dreamer of what is true, as Aristotle put it. In the same article, the interest that M. Morse shows in Albert Dürer seems to me quite significant in this regard. In his younger days, when he was preparing the engraving Adam and Eve, 1504, he had hoped to capture absolute beauty by means of a ruler and a compass. Shortly before he composed the Melancholia of the Fontfarge, which was for him the portrait of geometry, he was forced to recognize, "But what absolute beauty is, I know not. Nobody knows it except God." Marston Morse remarks that Durer was a creative mathematician as well as an artist. He wanted his geometric theories to measure up to his art, and his discontent on this account was unique among artists of all time.